Now, as I introduce the panel, and I'll ask Al Reese to come forward, he's going to be our moderator, I think all of us recognize that when we think about professional education, even if we were to start today, we're unlikely to be able to deliver it for at least a decade or more. So getting started is really a key factor for all of us. And so in the continuing part and the last part of our dialogue, we've assembled a group to think about where health professional education is today and where it's going, how we can continue to ground it in the science that has made us so great in terms of medicine in this country today, but to connect the humanism, to think about the interdisciplinary education, the cross-disciplinary education and training, the team-based education, and the use of online technologies that will be transformative. I'm very pleased that Al Reese will be our moderator for this. Al might be a professional dean. He was the dean of the University of Arkansas before he became dean at the University of Maryland, where he's also the vice president for medical affairs. He is a really extraordinary leader in academic medicine, a continuing investigator himself, carrying on NIH-funded research, a passionate supporter of education and research, former chair of the Council of Deans, and I think a perfect person to host and moderate our last panel. Al, I'll let you introduce.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you so much. It's certainly a pleasure to be part of this distinguished program this morning and to be part of this distinguished panel. We realize we're the last group, so we have to put things together. That's a strong, long order that we have. But before I get into any more details, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists to you. The details of their biographies in the booklet, so I'm not going to read that in any great detail, except to briefly introduce them to you. To my immediate left, we have Dr. George Theobald. He is the president of the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation and the Daniel D. Fetterman Professor of Medicine and Medical Education Emeritus at Harvard Medical School. To his left is Linda Aiken, the Claire M. Fagan Leadership Professor of Nursing, Professor of Sociology, and Director of the Center for Health Outcomes and Policy Research at the School of Nursing at the University of Pennsylvania. And to her left is Dr. Catherine Lucy, the Vice Dean of Education at the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. And last, Dr. Daphne Kohler, who is the Motwani Professor in the Department of Computer Science at Stanford University. Well, we have the duty of putting it all together in terms of transforming the educational offerings to the health professions, and thereby, if you will, preparing the next generation of practitioners, educators, innovators. My task is to make some brief remarks, framing the issues, and focusing on a couple areas, and then I'll have each panel member make also brief comments. So let me begin by pointing out here that health professions education over the years has gone through a number of transforming periods. And you've heard many being referred to this morning. But I think it's fair to say that much of the transformation has been fueled by new knowledge and innovation. One of the historic transformational periods you've heard discussed at length this morning, that's the Flexnerian period, of which Abraham Flexner in 1910 really evaluated medical education, the way it's being offered, the way it was offered in North America at the time. And I think what's most important to point out is really what Flexner said relative to medical education. He stated that scientific inquiry and discovery, not past traditions and practices, should point the way to the future in both medicine and medical education. At the time, medical education was being offered by many institutions in a very unsatisfactory way. He pointed out that there were no defined standards, no defined goals. There was a lack of a core curricula. There are too many medical schools, and in fact, most were proprietary. They were more for profit than they were for education. You know the end result of that report, which is really a transforming period in the history of medical education, is that, in fact, there's a drastic reduction in the number of medical schools nationwide, I should say, throughout North America. But most importantly, I think it led to the establishment of standards, uniform standards for admission, education, and graduation. I'm going to cite one other period that I believe was transformation in our history, and one in which the IOM played a pivotal role, and that is in 1999. I think the publication of the IOM report, To Err is Human, Building a Safer Health System, was another transformational point. And as we know, that report concluded that tens of thousands of Americans died each year as a result of preventable mistakes, somewhat or for the most part related to training or trainees. And that led to the Accreditation Council of Graduate Medical Education, or ACGME, in 2003, establishing for the first time defined time frames in which trainees should be trained, beyond which they should be sent home to rest and recover and return. So that led to the 80-hour work week. Today, we're entering into another transformational period, and that is one that is being fueled by the enormous, if you will, the avalanche of knowledge and education. It has been stated that knowledge doubles every 5 to 8 years, but at the pace that we're now moving, knowledge will be doubling every year. So in fact, health institutions are being challenged to incorporate new knowledge, new technologies, new discoveries, interdisciplinary practices within the health professions and its educational offerings in order to keep up with the pace of this evolving education. So in fact, we have a problem of great sheer knowledge, huge new concepts and skills that we have to introduce. These will very much influence what we teach, how we teach, and how students learn. Now, in addition, we're being challenged also, the health profession education is being challenged also by not only by the scope of the totality of information, but rather the diversity and the pace. Let me just give you some example of certain challenges that we all appreciate. One is the rapid advances in science, technology, learning, teaching approaches. For example, the whole genomic science revolution, bioinformatics, personalized medicine, stem cell biology, regenerative medicine, advanced imaging technologies, advanced surgical technologies. For example, a whole new field of composite tissue transplantation or face transplantation, limb transplantation, robotic surgery, the new techniques in learning or technologies in learning, wireless technologies for electronic health records, the World Wide Web. Patients are becoming learners. They are becoming very much informed, sometimes by valuable or reliable, and sometimes not so reliable information. That's a new challenge for practitioners of various types to be kept up to date in what's important and what is not, because patients are presenting themselves presenting to us with information. There's a whole new era of computer and mechanical simulation laboratories that are established for teaching basic techniques. That is becoming commonplace. There's an audiovisual generation. Students are now rarely using textbooks. Those of us who are writing textbooks, we may want to rethink how much we write, and they're becoming obsolete. So royalties may be changing. Getting to other areas of software, such as Evernote, MedCalc, Hippocrates, QX Calculate. These are all the new medical assistance software. So what we see here is the presentation of education is changing. But I'm reminded of the Flexnerian era, where Flexner pointed out that there was a profit motive that was involved in medical education. And one may question whether these new software, these new technologies may not themselves have a profit component or commercial component that may be inadvertently or in a subtle way entering into medical education. How are we monitoring these for accuracy? How are we monitoring these for impact? Let me conclude my comments with just 3 examples of innovations, discoveries, that we have to find some way of incorporating into medical education, or at least preparing our students to handle those new discoveries and new innovations in a very practical, clinically based manner. Example number 1, bioengineering and regenerative medicine techniques. These are already being introduced clinically. You have tissue and bioengineered products. How do we integrate that knowledge? How do we integrate information about new medical devices into our health professions curricula? Example number 2, Genome Sciences. This is a cutting-edge area that is giving us insights into the mechanisms of human diseases that would be unimaginable a few years ago. Association between specific mutations or polymorphisms and specific diseases are piling up. The transition of genome sciences, to genome medicine, but most importantly, to personalized, individualized medicine, which for the most part we're on the brink of experiencing. How do we prepare our students to use these new discoveries and these new innovations in a practical way in the not too distant future? I'd submit to you that as educators and as health administrators, we must ensure that our health professions curricula reflect the major discoveries and innovations of the time. One may consider, for example, and I will conclude by saying, an approach that at our own institution that we've been exploring is, as opposed to considering educational offerings in the static mode, biochemistry, microbiology, anatomy, they're static mode, to introduce offerings such as research education as a regular course that becomes a living course that could be updated as innovation and discoveries evolve. Using students, teaching genome sciences students, having students use their own samples to do genome-wide scans and study those as part of their educational offerings. I think in summary, health profession education needs to be monitored. It needs to be reviewed. This needs to be conducted on a regular basis to be sure that the offerings that we provide to our students are keeping pace with the evolution of contemporary developments and innovations. We must be prepared to make curricular adjustments as are appropriate in order that the students of today will indeed become the practitioners and the innovators of tomorrow. What I'd like to do is to transition to our panelists, and they're all prepared to put it all together. That's just a joke. But I'll start with George to my immediate left, and I'm sure he will share with us some of the challenges of interprofessional education and maybe how we could overcome this. We've had discussions earlier in the day about things that we know we should be doing, but we're not doing. So George, you want to enlighten us?
Thank you very much. First, I want to say how wonderful it is that the IOM has spent a day talking about this important issue, this realization that we won't have enduring healthcare reform in this country unless we pay attention to the healthcare workforce, how we educate it, what its skill mix is, what its mix of professionals is absolutely central, and I'm so glad that we're doing it. I'm so glad that we've had such wonderful people that preceded us that have anticipated everything that needs to be said. And now we have to try to pull it all together and say, what should we really do about it? What I want to try to do is set forward what I think are what I would call the 6 great challenges facing health professions education today. And here I'm thinking broadly about the education of the health professions, because I think these are cross-cutting issues. And that I feel that without doing these, we will not preserve what has been an absolutely excellent system of education, but unless it keeps pace with the changing societal needs and the changing delivery system needs, it will not continue to have the excellence that has made it a beacon around the world that people come here for. The first challenge, I would say, is that going back to the time of Flexner and the reports in the other professions, we set very high standards, and we can be very proud of the high standards that we've set across the health professions and education. But those standards have been inward-looking. We have satisfied the standards and needs of each profession, and to some extent of each of the institutions in which the education occurs. But we've not been outward-looking enough to say, are those standards reflective of what societal needs are? Are we measuring ourselves as educators and as educational institutions as to whether we're actually meeting society's needs as opposed to whether we're actually meeting our needs? And I would say we have not been sufficiently outward-looking. We have not sufficiently aligned our educational processes or products with what society needs, both in terms of the skill mix, in terms of the specialty mix, and in terms of the distribution. So that overriding theme of alignment and of looking outward for the standards and measures of our success, not abandoning the inward measures. We must still have the professional standards, must still meet the institutional needs, but must add to that a third dimension, which is the societal test of whether our educational process and products are meeting society's needs. We must align the two. And that came out loud and strong in Julio Frank's report. And I must say, though my observations are based almost entirely on a U.S. experience, they really parallel very strongly the wonderful work of the Lancet Commission. So the second challenge is that even though we have an increasing body of evidence that healthcare delivered by well-functioning teams, and here to emphasize well-functioning, and not all teams are well-functioning, is better care, better patient outcomes, more efficient, and actually greater professional satisfaction, and that has been spoken to many times today. But yet, as also has been referred to today, we continue by design to educate our health professionals separately. That needs to change. We must have meaningful interprofessional experiences, and one of the very wise, recently minted health professionals said, that doesn't mean just sitting side by side in class with another health professional. That means learning from, with, and about each other, doing meaningful work together in robust and rigorous educational experiences that happen throughout the continuum of the educational experience and continue on into the postgraduate and professional level. Meaningful educational experiences that makes it a core competency that you know how to work in teams, you know what other members of the team do, and that you've had real experience doing it before you enter the workforce. The third challenge facing us is that even though we know, as has also been well commented on by others, that the burden of chronic illness in an aging population is going to mean that more and more care needs to be given across the continuum, most of it or much of it outside of the hospital setting. We continue to focus most of our clinical training in the professions on episodic care, and too much of it is still hospital-based. Hospital still is an absolutely essential part of the educational continuum. But we need to move more training out into the community, form new relationships to take advantage of wonderful new phenomenon like teaching health centers, make alliances with integrated systems in the community, and distribute care distribute education so that education occurs where care is going to occur, and we appropriately prepare people for the professional roles that they're going to have, and that we educate people as much as possible in places where well-functioning teams exist, so we're modeling the skills and behavior that we want them to acquire. The fourth challenge is that we've done a very good job heeding Flexner's advice that we teach the biological science and physical science basis of medicine very well. It's not to say we can't always improve that, but I believe we do that very well across the country and across the professions. What we do less well is teaching the social sciences, teaching other sciences that are critical to the practice of medicine today, an understanding of systems, an understanding of economics, and an understanding of professionalism and what that means. We need to integrate those new content areas, integrate them, not add courses, but integrate them into the fabric of our educational processes across the profession. The fifth challenge is that the health professions of all professions invest the least in their faculty and faculty development. Part of that is a product of the development of the wonderful academic health centers that most of us are a part of, mostly a post-World War II phenomenon where research and clinical care are part of the same enterprise that does the education. That's not true in other professions. So that education has been diminished in the amount of time and the stature of our faculty. If we're going to have outstanding education and if we're going to have educational innovation, we need to support and promote the faculty who teach, nurture and support careers as medical educators and educational innovators. The sixth challenge is that though as health professionals we've embraced technology in delivery, some would say overly enthusiastically embraced it at times before it was proven, but we've been very slow to embrace technology, educational technology, and information technology, and that point has been made also, but particularly on the educational end. We need to get out of the lecture hall. We need to use much more innovative techniques of education using online learning, asynchronous learning, simulation, if we're going to address the expectations and needs of modern learners, and also if we're going to address some of the other challenges, such as interprofessional education in a more distributed educational system. So I would say these six challenges are what we as educators should be working on. I believe that we can do it. I believe we can do it because I know examples now around the country where every one of these challenges is being successfully met, but yet none of them is the norm yet. In order to do this, we're going to have a culture change, and people have spoken about that. Away from the single autonomous physician, away from each profession being protective of its own turf and its own way of doing things. But the beneficiary will be the patient, and the ultimate beneficiary is an educational system that is truly aligned with the delivery system in a feedback loop that the two are working together hand in glove, constantly feeding back to each other, and going forward together, making changes together to improve patient care in the interest of our patients, which is what the educational system is all about. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Linda, George has actually given us a challenge relative to interprofessional education and how we should maybe craft things. Now, with regard to interprofessional teams or environments, how would you address that area?
Well, I'd like to speak to the basic premise, which may be obvious, but perhaps could be appreciated more if we thought about it in a slightly different way. And that is that interprofessional education really cannot be accomplished by educators only. We all know this. Even try as we might, we have a relatively short period of time with our students. And so when we think about where is the most influential classroom, it's clinical practice. And that's obvious. We've had this theme that's been running through the day, but I'd like to talk about clinical practice as the most influential and important classroom and how we could strengthen it as a classroom and think more about it as not even an adjunct, but really the central place where we learn the behaviors that will stay with us for our entire lives. And I'd like to take on like three aspects that I think constitute an actionable agenda for developing really more of a focus on clinical practice as the classroom. And one is the disparities in education across the health professions that create some of the reasons why we don't have teams that are fully functioning. Secondly, I'd like to focus briefly on these very large and expensive service platforms that we have in our academic health centers, and are they really the classrooms that we might envision? And third, we haven't talked a lot about public policy today and how public policy levers could help us facilitate an interprofessional practice and education agenda, but I'd like to touch upon them briefly. Now, starting with the issue of disparities, not in care, which we've talked about today, but disparities in the basic education of the health professions. Lewis Thomas once described nursing as the glue that holds healthcare together. Nurses are woefully uneducated as a group. This is one of those perhaps inconvenient truths. We haven't really discussed it much today. But less than half of nurses in the US, the 3 million nurses that are in practice, have even a baccalaureate degree. And still, 60% of all new professional nurses in our country are being licensed with only an associate degree education. Well, some of the important aspects of interprofessional education and practice that we talked about, the idea of leadership, of negotiation, of critical thinking. Well, basic education is the building block for those particular skills and expertise. And so in the biggest part of our healthcare system, we don't even have the minimal level of education that would allow us to expect that our providers who are at the nexus of care in almost every setting, that would be really part of every team we would ever imagine having, they're really not well enough educated. Now, we have a great deal of scientific evidence that shows that having a better educated workforce returns better outcomes to our clients, lower mortality, lower readmission rates. Everything we look at, nurses' education is associated with. So I think that we have to take on that issue if we want to have fully functioning teams, and certainly the IOM Committee on the Future of Nursing has taken it on and has recommended by 2020, which is not too far from now, that 80% of nurses in a country should have a minimum of a bachelor's degree. Well, there comes the power of the market, which is actually functioning, because since the IOM made that recommendation, we see a great deal of preferential hiring of nurses with baccalaureate degrees. In my city of Philadelphia, you can't get a job in a hospital if you don't have a baccalaureate degree. That's very powerful. But going on to my agenda of public policy, we don't really use public policy to incentivize the kinds of changes that are needed in education like we use it to incentivize what we want in clinical practice. And so I think we need to rethink that, and to say if we want a baccalaureate nursing workforce, we should target all of our monies to pay for those programs that produce the product that we want, instead of the kind of amortizing equalization of the public monies that we have across all of the programs in nursing. Secondly, I'd like to focus on the very big and expensive platform that we have in our academic health centers. I know at the University of Pennsylvania, our health services platform is a major part of the budget of the entire university. And yet, are these operating as the clinical classrooms that they could? And I'd like to focus on one thing that is different and troubling. They've never really been the clinical classrooms that they could be. But now they're under such pressure to produce productivity gains that really nobody in academic health science centers any longer has the capacity to take on students, any kind of students, medical students, nursing students, psychology students, pharmacy students, because the productivity standards are so high. We happen to get one of the new graduate nurse education demonstrations that's part of the Affordable Care Act. which for the first time on a demonstration basis, CMS is going to pay nursing schools to pay for clinical preceptors in order to expand nurse practitioner training. We have 9 nursing schools in our network. The deans are very happy to have the money to incentivize clinicians in the community to take on advanced practice nurses, but they are deathly afraid of what's going to happen in 4 years if that money is not continued by Medicare, and will all of their clinical precepting opportunities dry up. So this is another take on graduate medical education, graduate nursing education that's a little bit different from the debate that we have been having about it, but I think is more and more essential to how we use that clinical platform and how we perhaps need to take that into account in terms of these productivity standards. And then finally, just quickly back to the public policy agenda, I've already mentioned using payment reform as we have in care to target and guide educational reforms that we want in education, giving the example of nursing. I've given the example of the GNE policy change and how we're going to really institutionalize, or are we, the payment of preceptors in this highly targeted and difficult productivity area. Clearly, we need to use payment incentives to create these examples that model the behaviors that we want. And when we do that in payment policy, we need to do it with provider-neutral language so that the ideas we haven't even thought of today will be possible tomorrow using those payment mechanisms that we develop today. Thank you.
So Catherine, my question to you is, will you be able to introduce certain healthcare educational strategies that could seed our young people for the future?
Yes, thank you very much. I really have enjoyed today. It's deeply gratifying to see the Institute of Medicine tackle this topic, and much of your work has influenced a lot of what I've done at institutions across the country around education. You know, as a medical educator, I look at medical education today, and I think it's the golden age, because we know more about how doctors learn, how other health professionals learn, how to teach and assess than we ever have. And innovations abound at medical schools and nursing schools across this country. But as an internist, I ask myself, if medical education is so great, why isn't U.S. healthcare any better? And I think the answer is that our techniques are terrific, but our target is off. We have become very, very good at producing the ideal physician for the 20th century, but of course, we live in the 21st century. And we need to rethink the target if we hope to achieve the goals that our society expects of us. You know, I was very influenced by Julio Frank's article in The Lancet and his talk this morning, and I think taking it one step further, what he is telling us and what we need to remember is what one of our young physicians said, is that we have a social contract. And medical education is part of that social contract. And the purpose of medical education is to improve health, not simply to train physicians. And if we redesigned our curriculum with that ambitious goal in mind, we would be turning out physicians that look quite a bit different. And we work with our colleagues to turn out other health professionals that also might have different roles and responsibilities. The target we have for medical education today is virtually the same as the target that was around when disease was acute, and when the entire therapeutic and diagnostic armamentarium could fit in a single black bag, and when knowledge about biomedical science progressed not in terms of days, but in terms of years and decades. And the model we use there is the model of what people have talked about today we call the hero physician, the strong, independent, rugged, authoritative, autonomous, idiosyncratic, selfless individual who did everything and everything for everyone, and then got up and did it again the next day. And medical education reinforces that with our teaching and assessment and the licensing and certification assessments that we use that ensure that our graduates are expert at providing care in a solitary and independent way. And we hope when they're finished with that solitary independent expertise that they can add that to a team and that care will somehow be improved. But you know now that disease is chronic, as we've talked about. Science is rapidly advancing at a pace that's breathtaking. Information is overwhelming. It extends beyond what any of us can manage from a cognitive capacity perspective. And our patients are in this web of individually expert health professionals, none of whom know who each other is, what their roles are, how to communicate effectively, and certainly no one has been trained to engage in the type of continuous quality improvement that we need in the systems that we design to serve our patients. Our failure to translate the breathtaking biomedical and scientific advances of the past 50 years is not a failure of the medical education system to produce individually expert physicians. It's a failure of the medical education system to understand that in this day and age, individual expertise is necessary but not sufficient. And if we hope to deliver on that social contract that said medicine, the purpose of medical education is to improve health, we need to sunset that hero physician for once and for all and instead target the development of a collaborative health professional who can, in the words of Paul Batalden, both do work of healthcare and improve work of healthcare in an interprofessional team. Now, this isn't about tweaking the curriculum. It's not about adding a competency or embedding a rotation and continuous quality improvement or having a classroom experience in interprofessional education, as our young colleagues talked about. This is about fundamentally redesigning the professional identity of the physician to one where systems, knowledge, and skill, complex adaptive reengineering, bioinformatics, and patient-centered counseling is on equal setting with the traditional biomedical sciences and clinical skills. It's a redesign of who we are, and it is absolutely critical that we make it quite clear that is a different era, and we need a different type of physician, one who's built on our foundations but adds additional skills. Now, we can take information from Flexner to help guide us about how to get there. One part of Flexner's work that is really underappreciated is the structural changes he put in place. He realized that if you just simply added biomedical science to the curriculum and then dispersed students into the environment to be mentored exclusively by people who taught in the 19th century model of care, that all of that advance would be washed out. So he said something very wise. He said, introduce the new stuff up front. Introduce science before those students are socialized into the 19th century model of education, of healthcare delivery. And we need to do the same thing today. We need to restructure health sciences education for physicians, for nurses, for pharmacists, for everyone who is involved in the primary responsibility of delivering care, so that the system is the first patient our students take care of. And so that the interprofessional team is the first authentic care delivery team that our students engage in. It has to be right up front before they continue their socialization into differentiated roles that reinforce that old hero physician moniker. Now, how does that work? I don't know. But there's plenty of experiments going on out there, and I think innovation around education is something we need to encourage and foster. We are much more happy about innovating in the biomedical lab than we are in the classroom, and it's time to sort of switch that model around. So here's some things we've been talking about at UCSF and with colleagues across the school, across the country. We think actually that the first experience that our students have when they come into medical school is to, in fact, join an interprofessional team, be schooled in complex systems redesign, informatics, and collaborative teamwork, and then be deployed into our institutions, into our communities, into our practices to work on real problems with real professionals and achieve real outcomes for our patients and for our institutions. Authentic work is a critical element of workplace learning. We know that from a pedagogical perspective. And these teams, these patients, these systems teams, as the students enter them, they should not enter them as junior physicians or junior nurses or junior pharmacists. They should enter them as systems professionals. And these teams should be embedded longitudinally in clinical microsystems, ICUs, community health departments, ambulatory services, emergency departments. And they should learn to work over a longitudinal perspective with the professionals in that environment, because that's what we know works in continuous quality improvement. It has to be originated by the people in the system who own the problem and who can continuously watch it evolve. This is not something where we need a revolving door of ad hoc projects foisted upon people who are already very busy in the clinical environment. They should be mentored by interprofessional faculty. They should be assessed, both in terms of their own knowledge, but also their ability to contribute effectively in a team-based environment. They should learn side by side the other clinical skills and biomedical science that will allow them to differentiate into more specific professional roles. Now, if we do this right, there's a lot of benefits that can come out of this. We can finally tackle all those systems issues, satisfaction, safety, quality, patient-centeredness, equity, disparities, that we don't have enough people to work on. And that's a renewable workforce. 30,000 new professional students enter our doors every year and could be deployed on systems problems of great import to our institutions and to our communities. We can train the older physicians who haven't had the experience of working in new systems as the newcomers show them that this is actually possible to do. And we start them off in a career with success in solving problems in an interprofessional team, and that will then become their motive apparatus for the rest of their career. We think this is quite feasible. It requires bold steps, but we also think that it's part of our responsibility as we work to adhere to our social contract, and we believe that our patients expect us to do nothing less. Thank you very much.
Daphne, we've covered a fair amount on interprofessional, and students are very much getting the era of technology. How do you envision technology being part of the educational offerings that would really, again, prepare our students for the future practitioners and future innovators?
Thank you. I guess as the only non-medical professional in the room, this is my responsibility to talk about technology. So thank you for bearing with me despite my lack of credentials. We've heard a lot today about the explosion of medical knowledge in the last decade or 20 years or even more, where the amount of knowledge that students must assimilate seems to be growing at a rate that no one can really deal with. While at the same time, students also need to figure out how to integrate these different pieces of knowledge so as to come up with a more holistic view. Students can no longer deal separately with biochemistry, with physiology, with metabolism, and so on without putting them together into a coherent framework. For the past 300 years in medical education and other disciplines, the standard mechanism for conveying knowledge to students has been the lecture. I don't know how many of you know this, but the lecture originated in the days that there was, about 300 years ago, when there was one copy of the textbook. And the only way of conveying the information from the textbook to the students was to have the instructor stand there and read the book to the students. And that's why we still lecture today. It turns out, when you think about it, that lectures are not a particularly good way for conveying knowledge. The professor has to stand there, pick a particular pace, aimed hopefully at the median student, and just stand there and talk at them for a while, hoping not to lose the ones who maybe need a little bit of extra time, while not boring to death the ones who get things a little bit faster. At the same time, the lecture is an even worse mechanism for teaching the kind of integrative thinking that we need in order to put different ideas together or to foster the kind of team problem solving that we've heard so much today is a critical part of the modern day medical care. So if this is not the right way to teach, what is? Well, at Stanford and at many other places now, I think there is a move towards a more flipped classroom model, which leverages technology so as to move the lecturing out of the classroom and do in the classroom the kind of integrative activities that are so critical to developing these kinds of thinking skills. So I actually started doing flipped classroom in my class about 4 years ago, a bit before it became popular. It came to me when I was listening to a talk about YouTube, and I realized that it really wasn't particularly good of my time as a faculty member to walk into the classroom every year, teaching the same lecture that I teach every year, telling the same jokes at the same time. It just didn't seem like the best use of my time, and maybe I could make better use by actually talking with my students and doing some of this kind of creative problem solving that's important in disciplines outside of medicine as well. So what is this flipped classroom, and what are the two key pieces of it? There's the online component and the in-class component. The online component, I think the big revolution that we've seen in the last few years is that we now understand that we can do much better in online teaching by designing the course upfront for online consumption rather than what we might call the afterthought model, which is you stick a camera in the back of the classroom, record the professor teaching, and then stick it up on the web and hope for the best. We can do a lot better than that right now by constructing video modules that are geared for online consumption, moving away from some of the constraints that are imposed on us by a classroom setting. For example, why is an hour the right module of time in order to teach concepts? Concepts are actually much more modular and broken up into little pieces, and you can structure the curriculum in a way that allows students to traverse them at their own pace, potentially in different orders, and in a way that allows the student to refer back to a particular module when it comes up, for example, in their clinical practice in a few months or even a couple of years. So that modularity of the content is something that's much easier to build into an online framework than it is into a traditional in-class experience, even if that's captured later on in a video form. It's also much easier to build simple interactivity into a video format. So you can easily embed questions into the video stream, forcing students to engage with the material, make sure they're understanding, and have their attention retained. There's many pedagogical studies that show that this is actually a critical part of the learning experience in terms of retaining knowledge that can then be used down the line. These are the kinds of simple questions that, as an instructor, you might ask of students in your class. But when you do that, 80% of them are still scribbling the last thing you said. The ones in the back row are all on Facebook. And then the ones at the front, there's the smarty pants who blurts out the answer before 95% of the classes even realize that you asked the question, and the class moves on. Here, in the video format, every single student has to engage with the question and realize and that they don't know the answer, perhaps, and then we need to relearn the material. And then, of course, there's also the opportunity to build into the material much deeper questions that require students to think much more deeply about what's going on. And because we can use now technology to give them immediate feedback about whether they're getting the right answer or not. So as opposed to a standard paradigm where you give the students the assignment, takes them a week to turn it in, 2 weeks for it to be graded, and maybe 4 weeks after you taught the material, they realize that they weren't understanding the thing that they were supposed to. Here they get immediate feedback, get to try again, and get to achieve mastery in content before the topic moves on to something else that builds on it. And there's, again, educational studies going all the way back to renowned educational researcher Benjamin Bloom 30 years ago that shows that this mastery-based form of learning achieves well over a standard deviation of improvement in achievement scores relative to a traditional lecture. Finally, and this is something from the new generation, one can really leverage social networking ideas to foster interaction between students. Students can ask each other questions in the online format, and other students answer them. Many of us have bemoaned the fact that you can sometimes see a bunch of young people sitting together around a table in a coffee shop, and they're texting each other instead of talking to each other. Well, this is true, but this is one place where we could actually leverage these students' preferences for online interaction by allowing them to interact with each other through these digital media about the content so that they can help each other through the hard bits and stay retained. So there's been some suspicions about the efficacy of online learning, but there's actually been a series of studies in the last year and a half that demonstrate the fact that online learning, and most importantly, blended learning, is actually a very efficacious strategy and at least as effective and perhaps more so than traditional face-to-face lecturing. There's been a Department of Education meta-analysis that studied 50-some different studies and basically demonstrates that across the board. So that's the online piece. Let me briefly talk about the in-class piece. By moving to this kind of online format, we open up time in the curriculum for the kinds of things that we all agree are much more fundamental to students' understanding. The interaction between students and their instructors, the interaction between students and other students, often across medical disciplines. There's been, again, a range of studies by Carl Wyman, Eric Mazur, and many others that showed significant improvement in learning outcomes that used active learning in the classroom as opposed to standard lecture. For example, Wyman in a high enrollment introductory physics class used active learning and showed that improvements almost double in every single metric: engagement, attendance, and performance on a standardized test, where scores went from 41% to 74%. So we're talking about huge improvements by allowing students to interact actively with each other and with the material. It turns out that students really like this format. I moved my class to this format 4 years ago and spend the class time doing this kind of active learning based on what I see as the deficiencies in the understanding and what students saw before in the previous week, as well as just doing interesting case studies that extend beyond the basic material. Attendance in my class went up from 30%, which is a pretty typical attendance at Stanford classes that are televised, to about 60 to 70%, so almost double. And now we see that in other classes at Stanford, including at the Stanford Medical School. So one vision for the student, one vision for the future that I think we should really might help open up the curriculum in new ways is that students get the basic content, watching videos at their own rate, in the comfort of their own dorm room, reinforce it via exercises to achieve mastery, and then in class they come together and work with their instructors and with fellow students across disciplines to apply the knowledge to challenges posed by real patients. And by seeing the academic work in the context of real practice, the knowledge is much more likely to be contextualized and therefore retained. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, this is, we've covered a number of areas. We've certainly focused on the fact that there is so much information that's coming. It's coming in such diverse areas. It's evolving rapidly. Students are learning quite differently. There are certainly new technologies, and that which you're exposed to is quite different from what many of us had been exposed to. There's a comment that I think Catherine raised earlier that I would like to pose as a question and ask the group to maybe respond to. And a comment that Catherine made on that is, we are very comfortable in biomedical research on an experimental basis, but we're a lot more reluctant to do educational experiments in the classroom. And here's a question. If so, who would be the control? Would the students be their own control, or would you have others? What kind of outcomes would you look for? Would we look for specific deliverables? Just a thought. How would we use our educational experiment, or should we be doing educational experiments? And if so, how would we construct them? Would we use a biomedical model, or would we use a different model?
So I'll start, and I don't know if Don Berwick is still in the audience, but he wrote a great editorial in JAMA about the science of improvement, and talked about how one of the reasons that care delivery innovations sometimes fail to show the results that we see right in front of us in randomized controlled trials is because the context in which we deliver care, same as the context in which we deliver education, is so widely variable from institution to institution to institution. Things like who's in the environment, what incentives are present, what patients are you seeing? And he and others have advocated that rather than using kind of a typically reductionist biomedical model where we control for everything and have a randomized control, that we work in the realistic evaluation arena. The work done by Paulson and Tilley, which basically says you describe what you're doing, you describe in detail the context in which that intervention is enacted, and a priori you decide on what kind of outcomes you're looking for. And then you essentially say, this was the intervention, this was the context, these were the outcomes, and people can choose to decide whether it would work for their context based on matching the information that you have. So to answer, I think that there can't be a control in most education because our context is so very different from place to place. And in fact, we wouldn't want to control that context because then it would make it less the information gleaned from those types of experiments would be less generalizable. But we can certainly study it. It's just a different model.
And if we want to go get one step more provocative, and one may say, well, how do you know that that which you've introduced now is any better than what existed before? How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that most of what we're doing now hasn't been measured and assessed. So we're very satisfied with it. We see, because in fact it produced us, so it must have been pretty good.
That's a very good answer.
But I agree with Catherine. I think we need to measure, we need to assess, but it's never going to be a controlled laboratory experiment, and I don't think we should set that up as the standard. But what we should do is hold ourselves to the standard that if we're going to make an intervention, we're going to measure and assess the impact. And we measure it against what our desired goal is. Now, sometimes we can do before and after testing of attitudes and behavior, and that provides some information. And we sometimes have natural experiments that occur in a given setting where only half the class will do something, the context is closer to being the same. So there are some quasi-experimental situations that we can sometimes take advantage of. But if we look across what the needs are for change, if we hold ourselves to the standard that we're going to have to wait until we get controlled experimental data, we're going to be frozen in place. And in fact, we've never had those data for any of our educational interventions. So measure, assess, be clear about what your goals are, and ultimately the goal, as many of us have said, is of course improving patient care. It's hard for any given educational intervention to prove that any given educational intervention improved care. You have to see it in the context of a series of interventions with intermediate markers. For instance, if we know that teamwork is good, and we can measure now, and there are a number of measures of adequacy of team functioning, and we can see that an educational intervention actually led to better team functioning. And we have other data showing that better team functioning actually correlates with better care. I think that's a reasonable basis to say this is an intervention worth pursuing.
Daphne, you're going to make a comment.
Well, so it's interesting that you bring that up because last week I had the privilege of hearing former Princeton president and Mellon Foundation president Bill Bowen at Stanford giving the Tanner lectures, and he actually conducted just last year a real randomized case control study on the efficacy of blended learning versus traditional face-to-face learning. And one of the interesting things is that he spoke at length in his Tanner lectures at Stanford about the incredible challenges of doing case control studies and how he, in fact, at this point recommends against it as being the perfect, being the enemy of the good. And in his case, the case control study turned out successful, but he just says that this really slows down progress in evaluating new strategies in a way that is just untenable given the rate at which things should be moving. So I think this is in agreement with everything that we've heard from somebody who's actually tried to do it the hard way.
I would add, just again, probably not a surprise given my clinical focus, but a way to evaluate education is always to combine education with clinical innovation and measure the outcome of the success of the innovation on patient outcomes. And we have a lot of examples that are naturally occurring. We have the huge growth in retail clinics and involving students in those retail clinics and observing what kind of patients come in there and observing and documenting the outcomes of patients. Perfect example. Or many of our nursing schools have nurse-managed clinics. Dean Malise spoke this afternoon to this very innovative capitated program that we have to keep frail elders in the community, which is totally integrated with an educational program so that every student that's in the environment can make their contribution in a clinical setting, and then you evaluate the overall impact of the clinical intervention on the patient outcomes, which is how the students really learn.
So I think we're certainly, from what I'm hearing, there's an agreement that there ought to be experiments, but it ought to use educational standards as opposed to necessarily adopting or transforming the biomedical construct to an educational experimental model. Now let me pose another question for the entire panel. If indeed we've determined through whatever means that interprofessional education is the approach that we should take, and indeed that we have evidence, educational type evidence that it does work, should we formalize it within our institution, or should it be done in an ad hoc way? And I'm thinking of, again, the Flexnerian concept. The Flexnerian concept was that, in fact, education was rather, it was not formalized, it was not standardized, it was haphazard. So how should we do it?
Well, I'll take a crack at that because we've been about doing it for 3 or 4 years now at many institutions around the country. And I would say, first of all, yes, it must be formalized. The successful models to date, and again, they're increasing in number, but by no means the norm yet, have all been the result of rigorous planning, faculty across the health professions getting together, planning an intervention, a change in a course, a change in a venue, with clear educational goals. So it should not be haphazard. It must be structured with clear goals and measured outcomes, and it must be repeated. Now, how much it needs to be repeated, I don't think we know yet. And again, I want to make it clear, in advocating for interprofessional education, I'm not saying, and I don't think any of the proponents are saying, that this ought to be the way all of the education of health professionals occur. It ought to be a component of the education. There must continue to be unit professional education to develop the skills that are specific to that profession and the identity that's specific to that profession. So this is not about losing individual professional identity, but adding to it another component. I'd say the one thing that we are still learning about is what is the dosing effect? How much and for how long and in how many places? And we're beginning to get some information on that, but I think that's still work that needs to be done. But definitely needs to be structured, it needs to be planned, not haphazard. It's rigorous, it's a rigorous part of the educational experience. If this is core, it has to be treated as core.
Very well.
Yeah, so one of the things I think is really important to understand, and we keep sort of hammering at home, is that the goal is not interprofessional education. The goal is collaborative practice for better patient care. Interprofessional education is the tool that allows us to get there. Right. And so I think it's really important then we sort of look at that tool and sort of say, when do we deploy it? And I think some of the challenges we've had in interprofessional education that have gotten us pushback is we've tried to make artificial experiences and sort of put people together and sort of say, well, if you just get to know each other, then eventually you're going to be better practitioners. And the students see right through that, and they should see right through that. So I think we have to sort of realize that there's kind of two levels, in my mind, of interprofessional education. There's the common set of skills and knowledge that we all need to master, and Dean Shortell talked about that earlier. Things that we think are really critical in today's world that every professional understands: epidemiology, population health, continuous quality improvement. Some of those things can be very effectively taught in a uniprofessional environment. Then there are the things that have to be taught in an interprofessional method or mechanism. Things like relational coordination, effective teamwork, crisis team communication, respect and understanding for other people. Those have to be taught with all the professions together. And we do ourselves a disservice when we take sort of one monolithic view of what interprofessional education is. In our minds, the best thing to do is give it early in the curriculum, give it consistently in the curriculum, and make every single experience where the students are together authentic, working on real problems. There's plenty of them out there. We don't need to make them up.
Well said.
Linda, I think I'm certainly personally in agreement with you, because I do believe, as George said, it ought to be selective. Mm-hmm. It ought to be formalized. But I think in an attempt to try to make it generalized becomes defeating the purpose. Right. So what do you think of interprofessional education versus interprofessional training? And referring to training now in a clinical setting as opposed to education in the didactic setting. Sometimes people think of interprofessional education as having maybe a single course of biochemistry that everyone participates in, and that would satisfy, as opposed to maybe modules of educational offerings in the clinics or in settings in which. What are your thoughts on either or both of those?
I don't think you could use that terminology, first of all. That's my immediate response, education versus training. I think that doesn't work, because we want everyone to be involved in lifelong education, and I made the case that the clinical arena is such an important classroom, so we don't want to think about clinical practice as training, which implies more of a rote kind of thing than it really is. So I think we ought to stay on, education, and there are opportunities for education in schools, and there are even probably greater opportunities for education in real clinical practice.
Any other comments?
I'd like to add to that education is much better internalized and retained when it's contextualized in the context of a practical application. And so I think unifying education and training is maybe a slightly different perspective than just saying it's, we should call all of it education. I think it's really the combination of the two that is the most powerful. And I agree completely that it absolutely has to be a lifelong experience, that especially with the rate at which things are moving around us today, it's not possible to have education end at the time that we leave whatever school we leave, whether it's medical school or anything else, that it has to be something that we continue to get little booster shots of education, so to speak, throughout our entire careers.
Let me ask you a last, sorry, George.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with that, and it comes back to what I said earlier, that ultimately, in the idealized functioning system that we're looking ahead to 2020 or beyond, the delivery system and the educational system really need to be intertwined in a really hand-in-glove way, so that we think of them more and more as being part and parcel of the same thing. And it's not like you leave one and go to the other, but in fact you are continuously in the intertwined education and delivery system. And one of the things that I think is very important as we think about some of the exciting delivery reforms that are going on, some of which were referred to today, that those occur mindful of the important role of learners in them, and always say, where's the learner in this environment? If we're going to create a new medical home, or we're going to create a new kind of integrated system, where is the learner in it? Because if we don't put the learners in that system, and we leave the learners to only learn in the dysfunctional part of the system, we're going to worsen our problem.
My last provocative question that I want to throw out before we engage the audience, and that is, as we talked about preparing our students to be future practitioners and future innovators, lifelong learning we talked about is something we want to inculcate. In light of the rapid advances in knowledge, how do we prepare them to use those new developments, discoveries, innovations that are actually occurring now, but will be used later on? How do we incorporate that into our educational offerings now? How do we train our students to handle that in the future?
I think that's a really critical question, and one of the things that we've looked at with our basic scientists is the amount of time we spend teaching sort of traditional biomedical concepts versus the amount of time we spend teaching cutting-edge science. And we think we need a little bit more of the cutting-edge science as foundational at this point, so that people are going to be prepared to understand the revolution that is upon us now with genomics and proteomics and IPSIs and things like that. But I think the other thing we need to think about, too, is how will people use that information in the future? What's going to be the cognitive task of the physician 15 years down the road when there are major decision support tools that are embedded in every electronic medical record that you type in the person's symptoms and outspouts diagnostic and therapeutic information. And that's why I think we really have to be thinking not only of the biomedical science, but things like informatics that help physicians learn to be critical users of the information technology support that will underpin their practice pretty quickly. But it's foundational science. It's just foundational science that are a little bit more advanced than we're typically teaching right now.
George, you want to comment?
Well, sorry. So it's been said many times today, there's too much knowledge to learn, and our job as educators isn't to impart all the facts, but to imprint people, and Catherine said it earlier, with certain behaviors and attitudes, which both the skills to acquire knowledge, but also the attitudes of curiosity, critical thinking, and professional responsibility to be motivated to keep learning for a lifetime. But that's what we need to do at the level of the school, not teach them more facts, but teach those behaviors and those attitudes, and show them examples. And they've come back with having role models and having educators devoted to that imprinting process.
Daphne, you're going to have the last one here.
So I'd like to, I completely agree with what both comments that were just made. The interesting point is that many of the technologies that you mentioned, those information technologies where a doctor has the ability to get from computer help in making complex diagnoses, a lot of these technologies have been around for well over a decade, and the medical profession has been reluctant to adopt them, I think partly because of the sociology of the doctor as a hero that we heard of, you know, I know better than anyone what I need to do for my patient. Along those lines, I was shocked as a non-medical professional hearing for the first time the notion evidence-based medicine and understanding that that was the exception rather than the rule. So I think there is a significant culturalization that needs to be done in medical training to make doctors more accepting of relying on tools that are at their disposal for collecting and assimilating lots of information. And while this might have been potentially optional 10 years ago, and the amount of information that was out there was limited enough that maybe arguably a doctor could actually keep it in his or her head, that's not going to be the case going forward. And without letting people, training people to be more accepting of relying on technology, it's going to be really difficult for doctors to continue to provide high quality care.
With that point, and on that note, I'd like to turn to the audience and invite your comments. Use any and all of the microphones to, if you would, please, short questions and short answers so that we can get through as many as possible. On this side, we're going to go back and forth.
I'm a nurse, midwife, and an anthropologist, and I like Dr. Thibault's statement that he felt that we should be really meeting societal needs. Well, I don't know how medical schools and nursing schools always meet the societal need. How do they find out what the societal needs are? Does it come out of studies and data and so forth? Or is there a role for what we're calling patients, which I call families, on the team? Because one of the real foci of the care that we give in Ward 5 here in the District of Columbia is to empower the women to take charge of their own health as much as possible and to transform them from depressed people who feel there is no tomorrow into people who feel they can do that.
What's your question, please? I'm missing it.
My question is how medical schools or nursing schools or whatever include the patients in deciding what the needs are in any particular area, because they might differ from place to place.
I agree with you, they should be. They're not as much as they should be. Some are doing that now, and that's absolutely right. We should be including patients and families in designing curricula, in designing clinical sites of training, and in evaluating the effectiveness of them.
I think, George, in the same way that we've come a long way now in having patients in IRBs and are making extraordinarily important contributions. There's no, am I on? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's no reason why patients could not, at least patients' input could not be used in medical education.
Absolutely.
Dr. Sullivan.
First of all, let me say thank you to the panel for a very stimulating discussion. I've learned a lot from this panel and the others today. But one of the things I would love to get reaction to is this. We've talked about what do we do with our students once we get them into our health profession schools. One of my concerns is the financial barriers that have developed to students becoming health professionals. We're seeing our students coming from more and more affluent families. This is different from what previously existed 50 years ago, where we drew more broadly from our society. So the question is, as we try and train professionals who are going to provide care for all segments of our society and geographic areas, how do we address that? So I think the training discussion has been very stimulating, but the question is, are we going to become a more elite profession, or are we going to be more broadly representative of all segments of our society, particularly since we're becoming much more demographically diverse?
Who wants to take that on?
I'm not going to answer that whole question because it's a big question, but I'd like to answer part of it, and that is I think we have to become more efficient in education because our educational programs are too long relative to what the students are learning in them. And the longer they are, the greater the financial burden on the students. And in the case I made about nursing, the idea that we expect nurses to go back to school over and over and over again to get to the minimum level of where we want them is a burden on them, takes away their earnings, increases the financial cost of becoming a nurse. So I think looking at the efficiency of education from the point of view of the student and how much does it cost not only in money but in foregone earnings to become a health professional, and we really haven't done as good a job there as we need to do.
Okay, Daphne?
Just to briefly expand upon that, one of the promises of online learning is that it allows students to get a certain fraction of their medical care outside an academic institution before they come into a residential experience, and that too is a way of lowering costs, potentially at least.
So I would say,
sorry, go ahead.
You're absolutely right, Dr. Sullivan. I agree with you. The increasing homogeneity of our student body socioeconomically is of great concern. We need to look at admissions policies, where we're going for our students and what our criteria for admission are, what we're doing to provide financial aid, what we're doing to improve the efficiency of the educational process. But it needs to be a concerted effort, I agree. And I didn't mention it in the context of, we were talk about the training, but it's a very critical issue, and thank you for raising it.
Very much so. I'm going to go to the back on that place.
Mitzi Duxbury, University of Wisconsin-Madison, retired. This was a day of explosion in knowledge, and many, many wonderful models have been presented. But I wondered if we might not look at other models, international models, that have been much more efficient, that have much lower infant mortality. The period of morbidity before you die is an average of 3 or 4 months, and in our country it's 4 to 5 years. And look at what makes these models work. Now, in Gerald Haig's axiomatic theory of organizations, there are 4 organizational outputs that you must meet. You must be effective, that's a good product. You must be efficient, provided at a low cost. You must be very flexible, and you have to pay attention to the satisfaction or the morale of your workers. Now, some of these models that we've been presented, and I think they're all exciting and need to be tested, but you have to meet those 4 organizational goals. And I think the knowledge explosion in the non-physician providers is enormous. And a lot of those things we don't look at. In this morning's paper, the National Research Defense Council has taken a very strong position on antibiotics in animals. And I don't think that end of the equation is met, much less our genetically modified foods, the hormones we put in foods, etc. And all of those people need to be a part of the team that we integrate in improving our health. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to, again, I'm going to ask the audience indulgence and have short questions, so there are many people around. I would love to get to as many as possible. So thank you very much for your comments. I'm going to move to this side, on the back.
Bill Stead from Vanderbilt. Again, thanks to the panel for showing the many dimensions of the flip we need and making it feel possible. My questions to Dr. Lucy, on the initial interprofessional system scientist portion of the education, what are your thoughts about dose, how long, and are you piloting it?
So we're actually designing pilots of those this year, and I think our intent would be that our initial vision is that students would undergo kind of a ground school where they would learn key aspects together of the core competencies needed for effective systems work. And we talked about those: re-engineering, continuous quality improvement, relational coordination, and importantly, use of informatics, especially electronic medical records. And then they need to come back and continuously revisit that as they're doing experiential work. It's the biggest question that, and George raised this, is we don't know what the dose response curve is. We don't know what the decay of knowledge is, or the decay of attitudes. And we also don't know the extent to which we can prevent that decay with some technologic advances. But if you have any ideas, we'd be delighted to talk with you about it.
Thank you. Right here, sir.
Steve Warmaker, American College of Physicians. I'm really intrigued and think that the flipped system sounds terrific. And there is the potential opportunity for breaking down silos across medical schools with this. And I'm wondering, do people on the panel think that medical schools would be agreeable? Would Harvard be agreeable to using the Stanford online? Would UCSF be agreeable, et cetera? I think you get the idea.
As you know, Steve, I can't speak for Harvard anymore. Not that I ever could have.
So I'll address that briefly. One of the big challenges we have is we've moved as a profession generally from discipline-based courses like biochemistry, physiology, anatomy, to integrated courses, and every medical school has their own way of integration. And so it's hard to sort of say that right now a course, for instance, for UCSF would meet the needs of Harvard. But because of the way we've organized our knowledge. But I think it's exciting to think about these courses because they may be used by students online as, for instance, remediation or additional help or something like that. So there may be ways to share content that help the students, even if it doesn't necessarily replace one institution's course with another institution's course.
I think I may also add that in the past, it was standard practice that individual schools would have independent and distinct courses. I think virtually all medical schools now have varying types of integration, whether it be subject integration or just across the course. So anatomy doesn't exist in most places. Structure and development, and it's giving you basically physiology and anatomy all together. So there's no question that we could share across institutions. Let me move around to next person over here at the front.
Yes, I want to thank everyone for their wonderful contributions. I'm Lance Becker from the University of Pennsylvania. A question on the flip for Dr. Kohler. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the transition from sort of traditional lecturing to the flip method? A lot of us would maybe love to try it, but wouldn't have a clue as to how to give it a shot. So how do you make that transition? And as you think about that transition, we have sort of a large installed base, if you will, of educators in this country. How does it then maybe move to scale?
So I admit that it's actually not easy to do a flip, and it's a skill that none of us were really trained for as educators, and so it's a learning curve that one needs to kind of grit one's teeth and go through. I can tell you some of the things that I did that work effectively. The first is what's come to be called just-in-time teaching, which is that you have the answers to people's quiz results and homeworks from the previous week because of all of the instant grading, and so you know what they're not understanding. And so you can come to class and basically at that point do a little bit something that's like a standard lecture, but really focused on the misconceptions that students had, and in a way that is a lot more free form, because you don't feel like you have to get through the material, because if you don't get through the material, they're not going to be able to do next week's homework. So it kind of turns into more of a dialogue with the students around the material, and actually that's not too bad, and it's a skill that many of us, at least I found that very easy to do. The act of learning in the classroom is more challenging because it does require that you design activities that are, tractable enough to be done within the context of a single class, but not, but still challenging and inspiring to the students. And that, I think, is something that people can evolve to over time. They add a couple of these one year and then a couple more next year. I wouldn't try and do it all at once because, like I said, it is a challenge and there is a bit of a learning curve involved.
Moving to the back, sir.
Got a question for you. In John Seamley Brown's book, he talks about a new culture of learning based on advanced gaming and social networking. And he shows numerous references where people learn much faster and all the things you're talking about, team playing, solving problems. You only win if you cooperate. I mean, it's a fascinating thought, and he believes all of learning is going to be that way. Are there people in Silicon Valley that are working with medical schools that are trying to incorporate these things beyond the flip that is far enough out there, but to try to actually say that this is going to be the basis for learning? Or is he wrong?
Anyone wants to take that?
I think he's right, although I'm not sure it will be all that. But yes, there are people who are working on gaming platforms, particularly on initial sort of strategies of skills that need drilling. So for instance, EKG interpretation or acid-base interpretation or things like that, you can build platforms. We're currently working with one team to build platforms on physical diagnosis. So
yeah, he's talking about really these advanced games that take a lot of time.
Yeah.
Kids get involved. I'm just wondering if I should get my grandson involved in, learning how to spending, half his time learning about advanced
Sure.
playing games with other people of different disciplines so he can get into medical school.
Homeschooling for medical school.
Thank you. We're going to move over here, sir. Over here.
Yes, Oliver Fine again from Weill Cornell. I'm interested, Dr. Kohler, if you could just describe a little bit more what goes on in the in-classroom teaching. Is it done in small groups or is it done in large groups, the whole class? And secondly, in terms of your online training, do your students get iPads the way our students do on the first year of medical school?
Let me start from the second half because it's easy. I don't think iPads are essential to learning. I know we've come to think that, but it's actually, a computer works okay too. So no, our students don't get iPads, but they seem to function quite well without that. In terms of the in-class component, like I said, I think there is elements of that are done in the class as a whole, kind of a group discussion on the relative merits of this approach versus that approach, for example. A discussion on how different things fit together more holistically is something that's done as a larger group. But then, in addition, there's also these smaller team-based activities where the class is divided into groups of about 4 or 5, and students are asked to solve a problem that is posed at the beginning of the lecture, and they're working on it together for maybe 15 minutes. The TAs and I would walk around and point them in the right direction or say you're on the right track. And then after 15 minutes, different groups would present different approaches. There would be critiquing going on by other teams. And then often there'd be a time for a couple or maybe even 3 rounds of this, of progressively more challenging questions of that same type. So that, okay, you've solved this one, we've discussed it, now let's make the problem a little bit more interesting by adding this twist onto it. And that actually kind of mirrors in some ways the kind of problem solving that you would see in practice, where you start out with a kind of a vanilla problem and then oops, the patient has a complication, so now what do you do? How do you handle this next phase of it? And I think that mix is actually in many ways good as well, because there's also studies that show that if the class is all exactly the same and follows exactly the same template, it's less effective than if you mix and match different types of activities within the context of the class.
Dr. Johnson.
Richard Johnston, University of Colorado. We've alluded to this to some extent. We're changing the medical education system rather dramatically. Do we need to change the admission criteria? Other than being smart, diverse, and computer-friendly, are there other characteristics that would better prepare our next generation of physicians, nurses for delivering care and carrying out their professionals?
I would say most emphatically yes. That we should have a much, and this is beginning to happen in a number of places, a much more holistic approach to admissions where we're looking for communication skills, ability to work in teams, evidence of that kind of activity, and evidence of understanding this idea of a social contract. And we should be very explicit about that that's the kind of people we're looking for in the health profession, without sacrificing intellectual caliber, which I think we can do. And yes, I think we need to broaden our admission criteria, most definitely.
And Dick, I would say that is certainly if you will, an educational experiment that's ongoing now. and that is a whole concept of basically a holistic admission process at certain medical schools across the country. And the question will take years to find out whether or not that approach in admitting students based on the holistic criteria produces a different, better product than in the traditional mode. But it is, in fact, an ongoing process. Now, we're virtually out of time, so I will if you could talk really quickly, we could probably get your new members. I'd love to get you in the.
Thank you. Just real quick for Daphne, I see you're also a co-founder of Coursera, and I wondered if via Coursera or within Stanford there's any plans to develop online courses that relate to the health sciences in any way.
So we are privileged to have among our partner institutions at Coursera 2/3 of the top medical schools in the country, and we're definitely very excited about moving into the health space. We already have a number of healthcare, both medical school, public health, and we're now starting to move into nursing, veterinary, and other areas as well. So the answer is the most definitive yes.
If you go veterinary, think UC Davis.
Okay.
Last question in the back, please.
Steve Schroeder, UCSF, building on Dr. Sullivan's comment. The price of entry to the healthcare workforce is very steep, much higher in this country than elsewhere. The students graduate owing a lot of debt. 3 questions to you. How consequential is that for the selection of students? How consequential is it for what they do later? And given that schools react to cutbacks in revenue by just jacking up how much the incoming students have to pay, are there any prospects for bending the tuition cost curve?
Wow. Well, Steve, you always ask the toughest questions. So the evidence, and I think you know it, first of all, we don't know the students who don't even come because of the fear of it. And there's some suggestion, soft data, that that's disproportionately perhaps those from less advantaged backgrounds. They're not even willing to think about it because of the prospect of such debt. The evidence about the impact of debt on career choice is very confusing. And it isn't clearly a unidirectional factor. But those of us who spend a lot of time around the environment think it is certainly a factor in it. And it goes back also, I believe, to the increasing homogeneity of the student body. Independent of debt, if you have a student body that is most uniformly from the highest socioeconomic class, who've lived in certain environments that they're used to, and who are also much more oriented towards science and technology, you have biased the career selection independent of debt on entry. As far as bending the cost curve, it's a complicated issue, and I'll defer to the people around here, but we need to look at ways to provide incentives for students to pursue career pathways that would have more loan forgiveness, and we need to look at efficiency, and I know that's something you're interested in. There is no reason why lots of medical students couldn't go through in 3 years if we planned it.
Let me just quickly tie it up by saying we very much appreciate the comments from our panelists. I've taken away the ideas that we should be formalizing our introductions, we should be experimenting with educational experiments, we should try to accommodate innovation discoveries, we should try to stimulate lifelong learning, and we should also try to imbue in our students inquisitiveness so they can continue to find ways of addressing areas that we haven't necessarily taught, but they can actually explore their own and apply in practice. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you.